Welcome to the Secrets of SQL Server webcast. You inherited a database, now what? Sponsored by Idera and MS SQL Tips. I'm Greg Robidoux, co-founder of MS SQL Tips and today's webcast organizer. If you have any technical issues with the sound or screen quality during the webcast, you can use the question area to let us know. If you have questions during the webcast, you can submit them any time during the webcast by entering your questions in the question area in your presentation controls. We will try to answer as many questions as possible in the time allotted. This webcast will be recorded and archived for future playback, along with the slides, and you'll receive a follow-up email with the links. If you're not already a member of the mssqltips.com community, we invite you to join. You can go to www.mssqltips.com and sign up for our newsletter, read any of our available tips, download white papers, and watch any of our archived webcasts, as well as post your SQL Server questions to be answered by our community members. Also, after the webcast, please take some time to visit Idera's website at www.idera.com to learn about all of their SQL Server tool offerings, as well as download some of their free SQL Server tools. Our presenter today is Tim Radney. Tim is a production DBA, a manager for a large financial holding company, a partner at Lynchpin People, an author, and a trainer. Over the past 15 years, he's had several roles from systems administrator to eventually becoming a lead database administrator. So at this time, I'm going to turn things over to Tim, and he can begin the presentation.
Hi, and thank you, Greg. So I've been working with SQL Server for quite a few years. Past 5 years dedicated, only working with Microsoft SQL Server. Kind of turned loose of all the systems administration, systems engineering kind of roles, and have thoroughly loved it. I thought when I became a full-time DBA that I would be able to get in this little niche market and really be able to master a particular skill set, and boy was I wrong, thinking that SQL Server was this small thing. I mean, you can make a career out of any one field. There's 3 or 4 from development, administration, ETL, integration, business intelligence. I mean, it's a really, really great field to be in, and our community is incredible. That's really kind of where this presentation came from. I was convinced that I needed to start blogging about my experiences, being kind of new into just working with SQL and sharing what I'm learning. So one of the first blog posts that I did was about inheriting this database. That it was a very large database. For me, it was about 1 terabyte. So I wrote this blog post and was at my second past summit, and had met a few people over the years with like Jorge Segarra and various others in the community. So when I saw SQL Chicken, and I ran up and got to meet him for the first time in person, and we start talking, and he introduced me to another gentleman, Jose Chinchilla. And Jose said, "Oh, you're the one that wrote that blog post about the neglected database." He said, "You should do a presentation on that." So we conversed a little bit, and he convinced me to submit an abstract like that night, and then the next day he told me that I had been selected to speak, being that he was the event organizer. So then I had to go and rush and put together this presentation, and I say rush, had a couple of months to do it, but it was the very, very first one. So what I did is just looked over, thought about the things that I wish someone had kind of held my hand and told me about when I first took over this database environment. So with that, we'll get started. The very first thing that I like to look for is that I have backups. As a production DBA, my first responsibility is that I have data that is recoverable. So the questions I ask myself is, what I just inherited, is the current backup strategy that is in place adequate for the service level agreement of that system? Meaning, do my end users think that I can recover their database to a point in time? If so, do I have the right recovery model, and is the current strategy adequate for that? I may only be doing full backups each night, and these users think that I can restore them to within 15 minutes. If that's the case, I have a gap, and I have to mitigate that. It doesn't matter who had it before me. Now I'm the one holding the bag. I'm the one that's responsible. So it's my career, my job, my reputation, kind of on that line. Is there a place or a plan in place to validate these backups? There's a good saying out there that backups are worthless, it's the restores that are priceless. And my backup admin at work can tell you the same thing. It's like nobody really cares that he exists until they need some data restored. Then he's the most important guy in the company. Do you practice doing these restores? And when I say practice, I don't mean just restoring your last full backup. If you have a backup strategy in place that you're doing weekly fulls, daily differentials, and then transaction log backups, say every 15 minutes, do you have the experience to be able to go through and quickly restore your last full, your diff, and your transaction logs? Do you know how to do a point-in-time restore? Even though your transaction logs have passed 15 minutes, let's say at 12:13, somebody dropped a table or imported the wrong data, and your log backup is made at 12:15, then 12:20, somebody calls you and says, hey, we need to perform a restore. Do you restore back to the log that before, so at 12 o'clock? Or do you know how to do a stop at and tell it to stop at 12:11 just before that transaction was occurred that rendered the database useless? You need to practice those things. Recovering more than just your user databases. Have you practiced restoring master? Do you know how to do that? If you had to build a brand new server and recover the master database, do you know how? Do you know that you have to be at the same build number? Those types of things you have to practice and get used to. But the first thing is just making sure that you have those adequate backups and that you have the proper SLAs in place. Consistency checks.
Hey, Tim, can I interrupt you for a second?
Sure thing.
There's just one question about just the backup solution there, and the question was about large databases, and just wondering, are there any other recommended strategies for backing up very large databases that you can kind of recommend?
Yeah, great question. So when I took over the database department of this financial company, our strategy was full backups every night. Now, like I said, I had a terabyte database, one of the first ones that I kind of took over the system. The data, the change rate of that system was about 100 megabytes per day. Why was I backing up nearly 998 gig of data every single night that was not changing? So what we did is, for that system, we implemented a full backup once a month, differentials the other 29 days or every other day. That one was a little more unique. We ended up splitting into multiple file groups and backing up just the primary, kind of changed things up. But for most of your large databases and even medium size, full backups every night are excessive. Getting into a weekly full, a daily differential really works well. What that allows you to do is shorten your backup time and back up the amount of data that's traversing the network.
Okay, great. Just one other question that came through as well was about restores, and how often should somebody be testing their restores to make sure that they actually do work?
All right, another good question. I would suggest no less than once a month for each environment. I know individuals that have a dedicated environment set up that they go through, and once a week they'll test every single production database doing a restore validation. I've talked to some over the years that in their backup restore validation environment is also where they'll run their consistency check, so that they are not doing that in production. It really comes down to what is your pain point, your pain level. If you discuss it with audit, what do they recommend? Most of the time, as long as you do them and you do them regularly, they're comfortable. For me, once a month, and I have it rolling, so every day we're restoring a different set of databases. Then if we have a problem, typically it's going to be a global problem. So if it impacts one environment, it impacts them all. So I would say no less than once a month, but as often as you can afford. All right, we'll move on. Since we brought up consistency checks, Is there corruption in your newly acquired databases? If there's not a job or a process in place to already be running DBCC check DB, then you don't know. People ask quite often, how often should they be checking for, or how often should they be running DBCC check DB? This one is unequivocally, and it depends, but the it depends in this case means how much data can you afford to lose? Meaning if you're only running check DB once a month and you only retain backups for 14 days, if 21 days ago you had some corruption, what can you go back to recover? That data is lost. Many of us refer to that as a career limiting move. One of the few things that could pretty much guarantee your employment status ceases. Our job, we talked about it a few minutes ago, is being able to recover data. So if DBCC check DB isn't being ran, that's one of the real quick things you need to investigate and research. Not all corruption is data loss. I mean, you can have, I've run into situations where just dropping an index and recreating it would fix an error within DBCC check DB. I got lucky. I've had issues with some allocation tables that was easily repaired. But if you have true data corruption, the only way to get it back is from a restore, unless you're really good with a hex editor and know what it looked like. Now, there's a lot of commands within DBCC, and with checking for consistency, checkDB will check the entire database. If you're only needing to check your allocation tables, you can run the DBCC check ALLOC. And I mentioned a very large database that I had that we broke it up into multiple file groups. This was pretty easy for us to do because it was historical data. It was already broken out by quarterly tables. So we were able to go and move those quarterly tables into yearly file groups. So I have a file group for the year 2003, 4, 5, 6, up to current, where the current data stays in the primary file group. Since I've already backed up and I've validated those old file or the yearly file groups, I really don't have to worry about backing them up anymore. I also don't have to worry about running CheckDB against them that frequently because I know I have a backup that's been verified that I can recover the data if something were to happen. So in this case, I can just run the check file group against my primary file group for the data that's constantly in flux and being changed. So I no longer have to run CheckDB against that terabyte database. Now, my organization, we run CheckDB once a week. We keep our backups for 30 days. So we're pretty well covered. Now, the weekend when we run the CheckDB, we also refer to that as the stress test for the storage arrays because CheckDB is exhaustive. I mean, it will tax your system. So running it on a production environment, you really need to look for those maintenance windows, the time of day that it's not as heavily used. And for those that get really good at restoring weekly or even monthly on a validation environment, they'll run CheckDB there instead of running it against production. Statistics.
Hey Tim, can I just a couple questions that came up?
Yes, sir.
One is, what does DBCC stand for? If you can just kind of let people know.
I've heard it mostly referred to as like the database consistency checker or check.
Yep. Okay, great. And then the other question somebody had was, what kind of performance hit does it have if you're running it against your production databases? Do you have any? Is there any performance hit, or is it actually not a bad thing to do against production systems during the middle of the day?
Oh no, absolutely. You'll take a performance hit. I mean, it's going through and I don't want to say that it's reading every page. That granular. I mean, that's Paul Randall. I'm quite sure has all this covered in various numerous blog posts. But but yes, it does really stress the disk. Like I said, when we run it on the weekends, we refer to it as our storage stress test. If you want to fire up like SQL or a perfmon on your disk and start looking at the the reads or reads per second, and kick off DBCC check DB, you'll see it spike. So maintenance windows after hours is preferred.
Okay, great. Just one last question for this section. How often do you recommend running the DBCC check DBs? Is that weekly, daily, monthly?
Well, when I took over our environment, it was part of our full backup routine. So we were backing up a full database every night and DBCC check DB every single night, which both were excessive. We've moved to a weekly DBCC check DB routine, so we'll run it over the weekend. I'm a financial institution, so outside of their customer-facing systems, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. is maintenance window time. So we'll do that on the weekend since most of our branches aren't open. But it really comes down to what can you recover and how much data can you afford to lose. So for me, we keep enough backup history that I can go back to a previous backup and recover the transaction log. It's not an exact number, but I've sat through enough of Paul's presentations that he stated 95% of the data corruption that he's encountered has been related to either storage or a hardware corruption. It's trying to write to disk, the disk goes away. 5% bug. That number may be high. That was probably referencing SQL 2000 days. So if you have a transaction log that contains the data and you can roll forward, you can recover that corruption or the data that got corrupted. If you don't have transactions that go back prior to or backups that go back prior to the time that the corruption occurred, you have data loss. So again, I have 30 days worth of backups. We validate those. We run the consistency check once a week. So we're pretty well protected. I wouldn't stretch it out and do months, but daily is, if it's a small environment and it only takes a few minutes to run and you have the maintenance window, then why not? So it really comes down to your environment and your comfort level. All right, I think we'll go on. Statistics. Are your statistics up to date? When I'm giving this presentation at a user group or a SQL Saturday, I'll usually flip back to my previous slide and I'll ask the question, so what is the impact of statistics to the query optimizer? And inevitably, somebody will raise their hand and have the right answer and tell us that the query optimizer uses statistics to build the execution plan. So without current and good statistics, you're pretty much guaranteed to not get the good enough execution plan. So what does that mean? That means that the route that SQL takes to get to your data may not be the most efficient, meaning you could have high CPU utilization, you could have, you choose the wrong, table scans, bad stuff, things that aren't as optimal as they should. So as DBAs, what can we do to mitigate getting bad plans from out-of-date statistics? Now, one of the things, auto-update statistics is turned on by default when you install SQL Server. And that's great, and I appreciate Microsoft helping us out and having that feature. But it typically only updates your statistics after 20% of the rows change. Now, I know everybody's not like me and my environment, but I have tables that have millions, hundreds of millions, hundreds of thousands of records. So let's just say I have a table with 1 million records. I have to wait until 200,000 records get updated before statistics get updated. That might not be good for me. Now, if I only had 1,000 records, that's different. So the way that we mitigate this is we have a job that runs every night that runs SP_update stats. So it will update any statistics that need it. This helps. Our data warehouse environments that process and import large amounts of data, but it's still not enough for the tipping point of the 20%, then we may run update stats after an ETL process. I used to see where we would have environments where CPU would all of a sudden spike. We would run update stats, and that would fix our problem. Come to find out, when we'd run the update stats, it would make all the execution plans recompile on execute. So the next time that execution plan was reused, it would recompile. It turns out that was really what my problem was, is I had a bad plan, not necessarily from the statistics, but just the way the SQL Server with the query would come in, it would pick up a pretty bad plan, and really all I needed to do was flush my cache. So that was a little trick Kimberly taught in one of the immersion events, but the updating stats still fixed my problem. It just took a little bit longer. So what do you do when you inherit this new database? You can check to see if the SP_update stats is referenced in any of the jobs to see if that's been scheduled. If not, you may want to look into, are your stats out of date? How long has it been since they were updated? Are you getting the best plans for that environment? This is one of my favorite slides. Auto grow and auto shrink. And no, that's not my dog. So how do you control the size of your databases? Now, one, we really can't. We can't tell people they can't put data in the database, but the free space in the databases. Do you allow your databases to auto grow in size? And there's a little debate out in the community. Some will say, don't let it. Others will say do. I'm one of the ones in the do camp. I'll let my databases auto grow as a safety net, safeguard. My environment, we have 5 DBAs responsible for 5,000 databases. I can't go and every week make sure that the 1,000 that I'm responsible for have enough free space in the data file. I also can't control whether or not somebody imports an extra 10 gig worth of data. So if over the past 3 months we're averaging growing a gig a month, so I only keep 3 gig of free space and they import 4, I don't want that to cripple the system. So if I had auto grow turned off and we hit that limit, they're down. So then they've got to call into a help desk, open a ticket, it's got to get routed, and during that whole time we have customer impact. So I'd rather take a hit and let the data file grow as a safety net than to impact customers. Now, what I don't do is allow my databases to grow by a percentage, and definitely not by the old default of 1 megabyte. Way too many times I've inherited or taken over a system where the database is set to auto grow by 1 meg, and the thing is gigabytes in size. Now that's frightening, that this thing grew by 1,024 times every gig of size that it is, or that it's by 10%. Even then, it started off at 10 meg, and now it's 60 gig in size. How many times did it have to grow? So what's the impact if a data file or log file has to auto grow? Well, the transactions are stopped until that file grows and completes. Now, if you have instant file initialization turned on, well, that's great, and that will help with your data file, but it will not help with your log file. So what can you kind of do here? Well, you want to set an auto growth size that makes sense for the size of your database and the amount of growth that's coming in. Is it 100 meg? Is it 512 meg? Is it a gigabyte? It depends on your system, but it definitely shouldn't be 1 megabyte or 10%. Again, I take you back to the terabyte database. Yes, it was set to 10% when I got a hold of it. Do I really need to grow by 100 gig? And how long would that take? You know, that's some impact to the end user. What about shrinking? You know, that's an option when you're setting up database maintenance plans, and to shrink, and it's also an option within the properties of the database to auto shrink. Should we have that on? Absolutely not. Shrinking a database will lead to fragmentation, and fragmentation is not a good thing to have a whole lot of in your database. But are there times when shrinking a database is necessary? Absolutely. In my experience over the past 5 years, I've taken over numerous environments that, let's just say the database was 100 gig in size, and I go and I look, and the largest table is 98 gig. So 98% of the database is in one table, and I look at it, and it's logging every single mouse click or every single thing that's occurred in that database as an audit table for the past 6 years. So I raise my hand, I send some emails, I ask the question, how much of this log table do we need? Come to find out we need 90 days. All right, great. We can clean this thing up. So I always hope and go back to the vendor and ask if they have buttons that you can click within the application to set the retention period, and 95% of the time they do. So they do that. The system goes through and it purges all the old data that we don't need, and now I'm sitting there with 96 gig of free space in this file that we'll never ever need again. Yes, absolutely. At that time, shrinking to reclaim that free space makes sense. Free it back up so you're not using the space on the disk so another system can use it. But what happened when I shrank the file? Well, quite possibly it led to some fragmentation somewhere. So I optimized my indexes, and I'm good to go. So optimizing indexes.
Hey Tim.
Yes, sir.
Back on the previous slide, just a couple quick questions. So one question was about the 10%. Somebody just asked, is that 10% of the available disk space that's out there, or is it 10% of the database file? Can you just kind of...
Yes, so the default setting, or the auto growth setting of 10% is 10% of the existing file. So if your log file was 5 gig and you said to grow by 10%, it would grow by 500 meg.
Okay, great. And then the next question was, do you have any recommendations on what the value should be? I know you mentioned don't use 1 megabyte and 10%. Do you have some kind of rule of thumb to let people know kind of what the auto growth should be?
Yes, for databases under 10 gig, I'll usually set it to grow by a gig. If it's over, half a gig, so 512 meg. If it's over 10 gig, I'll usually set it to grow by a gig. But again, having a hard, fast, hey, this is best practice, it's hard to tell, because if I have a database that is growing by 5 gig a month, then growing by 1 gig would only buy me almost a week of time. So I want it to be small enough that it's effective and doesn't impact the end user, but I don't want it to be too small that it's going to be happening every hour or every other day either. So we do, if it's under a certain size, by default we'll set it to a smaller value like 512 meg, but we also have instant file initialization turned on. So for me, for a data file growing, it doesn't have that much of an impact. You also don't want it to be growing at such a size that you may not have that much free space left on the drive either. So if the thing's growing and you set it to grow by 10 gig and you've got 8 gig free, well, guess what? It's not going to grow and users are going to be impacted. If it was that smaller amount, it would still grow, allow transactions to occur, and then hopefully you're going to get an alert from whatever monitoring system to let you know you're out of disk space as well as you're out of free space in the data file. Okay.
Another question somebody has here is that they notice their transaction log just keeps growing and growing and growing. Can you tell them kind of what's going on there, why that would be the case?
Yes, you're probably not backing up the transaction log. So if you have a transaction log that just is continuing to grow. And I answer forums all the time. And it's a common question that comes up. Somebody may have a database that's a gig in size and a transaction log that's 100 gig in size. And it's because they've made a full backup of the database. The database is in full recovery mode, so that transaction log is not going to be truncated and start reusing the log until it's backed up. So a full backup doesn't truncate the transaction log for reuse. Only a log backup will do that. If that's not your case for the person that asked this question, then you've got a single transaction that is open, spanning all the VLFs in your data file so that they're not being reused.
Okay, and then one last question for this section is somebody mentioned that they keep doing, shrinking their transaction log, and then when they run index rebuilds, they notice that the transaction log gets really huge again. Can you explain kind of how that works and why that's the case?
Yes, so when you rebuild, you'll notice that your data file will grow. The estimate is it takes like 1.25% the size of the index to do a rebuild. Now, a reorganize will only use, I think it's 8K of additional space in the data file, but it is some long transactions while it's going through reorganizing the tables to eliminate the fragmentation. So you will see log growth with index optimizations. And if that's the case, then that's the size that your transaction log needs to be. If on the weekend you're doing maintenance and it grows to 20 gig in size, and then you shrink it, and then the next weekend it grows to 20 gig, well, you need to leave it at 20 gig and make sure that you get the appropriate space for your logs. Also, you may want to look at, are you overly optimizing? Are you trying to reorg indexes that may show high fragmentation but they're low page count? If it's a low page, you've got 100 records, the fragmentation of that table really isn't a big issue. But yes, index optimizations will grow your transaction logs. All right, I think we'll go on. Since we're talking about index fragmentation and optimizations, this is a great lead in. So do you have fragmented indexes? Yes, we all do. But what causes fragmentation? I usually joke and say not a whole lot, just your inserts, your updates, and your deletes. So pretty much everything that we do. So why is it important? When I started researching, because I'd just been told, hey, you need fragmentation's bad. You need to make sure that you're rebuilding or reorganizing your indexes. I took their word for it and I understood it, but I wanted to know more why. So I dug out a white paper from Microsoft that showed in their labs they were able to prove that index fragmentation slows down systems from average of 13% up to 460%. Based on the size of the environment and the amount of fragmentation. So let's just say that you inherited this database that has had no index fragmentation or optimization jobs running. So you've got indexes that are 99% fragmented, large tables, but the users have just gotten used to the slow performance of the system. So being a good DBA, you go through and you rebuild and reorganize the indexes. They come back in over the weekend and the system's running over 400% better. I'll tell you, that's the perfect time to ask for a raise, ask for a bonus, or ask for an extra week of vacation because you're the superstar. And it's literally that easy if fragmentation is what's ailing your system. So you find the fragmentation, what do? Well, you can rebuild, you can reorganize, or you can just drop and recreate the index. Scheduling rebuilds using a database maintenance plan, I think that's okay for small databases or small environments. It's real simple. SQL Server has a wizard that walks you through it. I don't like it for larger systems, and I really don't use the database maintenance plans because it doesn't allow a whole lot of customization. A custom script you can use and run as a SQL job, or you can purchase a third-party tool so you have a central UI for administering and looking at your fragmentation and scheduling rebuilds, reorgs. I typically use either Michelle Alfred's script at SQLful.com or Ola Hallegren at ola.hallegren.com. Both of these will either rebuild or reorganize based on the level of fragmentation of that index. So now if you're only concerned about fragmentation, say over 10%, but less than 30, you want it to reorganize, but anything over 30% will just rebuild the index. You have that level of granularity in both of those scripts. You can also base it on the size of the number of pages. You can choose online index if you have enterprise edition. I mean, it really gives you that level of customization that you may need for your organization. The other thing with indexes is looking for duplicate indexes. Duplicate indexes, we know indexes are great, right? Make queries run faster, make users stop complaining. So a bunch of them is great. Well, no, duplicates aren't either. A duplicate index can really have negative impact to your environment due to the fact that any updates, inserts, or deletes have to be done more than once for that index. I mean, it really serves no purpose. You're just duplicating effort, duplicating I/O, duplicating space. So there's scripts that are available on the internet. I mean, you can just Google or Bing duplicate index for SQL Server, and you'll find lots of scripts that have already been written that will go out and find these for you. Now, I do not advocate that, hey, it comes up in a report that it's a duplicate and go drop. You need to test, you need to validate, and as a good CYA, you want to script out the index before you drop it, just in case you have an oopsie. You can recreate it fairly quickly. Now, Greg, I'm sure this probably presented some questions.
Yep, there's a couple things. One question is about online index rebuilds, and just curious, how much additional space would they need if they did online index rebuild?
Well, again, it's back to that. The metric that I've seen is 1.25%. So if the table was a gig or the index was a gig, then it'd be 1.25 gig of space, and then also determines are you sorting in TempDB? There's a few factors there, but the rule of thumb is 1.25% the size of the index is needed when you're doing a rebuild.
Okay. Another question is about rebuilding indexes, and the person just wondering will this ever have a negative impact on the application or end user experience?
Yes, if you're rebuilding an index and you're on standard edition, then yeah, that index is that index rebuild will cause some blocking. Also, if you're doing it online during production hours, well, it's still going to generate some disk I/O. You may not notice an impact if you have fast enough disk and your system's big enough. But yes, these are all operations that impact disk and I/O.
Okay, and then the last question for this section is just about, can you give any sense of how quickly things get fragmented, or is there any way or some things that they should be doing to check for that on a daily basis?
It's all based on the rate of change. With the amount of inserts and deletes and updates going on, if it's a volatile table, it's going to be frequent, and your fill factor is a factor in fragmentation as well. And the amount of free space on the page, how much things have to be shuffled around. It's really just one of those things. There's DMVs that you can run to monitor the amount of fragmentation. But if the index isn't used, it's not really going to get fragmented frequently. If it's your primary volatile table, quite often.
Okay, actually, I apologize. There's a bunch more questions, but let's just take one more for this section. We can come back if we have time at the end. And the question is kind of to your previous slides about updating statistics. And the question is, should they update statistics and then rebuild indexes? Should they rebuild indexes statistics? So how does that work, and what does SQL Server do behind the scenes?
Yeah, that one may take a little time to answer. So I probably want to hold that one to the end.
Okay, not a problem. Why don't we keep moving to the next slide and we can come back if we have time.
Yeah, because we're 40 minutes in and got about 4 or 5 more slides to go. All right, so database ownerships. Who owns what? So who is the database owner of your database? I find quite often when databases were restored or created, the previous DBA or whoever was logged in that created or did the restoration, it takes their user ID as the DBO. You can check this out by running sp_helpdb, and there's not a whole lot of significance that I've found if the database owner is orphaned. Say the person left the company and it was tied to their employee ID. Probably the only time you'll notice is if you go to right click on the database and try to do properties, and it gives you a nasty message, and then you can go and run the stored procedure to change the database owner to SA or to yourself. So then you can look at the properties. But where it does become a big issue is with the database jobs. So they create a job or script it out and move to another server, and they are the owner of that job. Well, as long as they're employed and their ID is active and they still have rights, not a big deal. But a statistic out there is that the average tenure of a DBA is 18 months. So let's say somebody starts with a company and they create a bunch of jobs in your environment, and then they leave the company. There's 50 jobs out there that are tied to their ID. Your HR department a week and a half, 2 weeks later finally decides to get around to disabling their employee ID, and now you've got 50 jobs that failed because they can't run, because they can't authenticate that user. That could be your payroll file, could be any number of key critical important processes that failed because it was tied to their ID. Now if you're inheriting this environment, let's assume that you're now in week 2 or the last week of this person's employment, and they're doing a handoff, a knowledge transfer to you of this environment. Well, you've got time to go and find this and change it before it becomes a problem. You also have time to ask them about documentation of this environment. Knowing who else touches your databases or who all you're touching with the ETL jobs that are running on the server is pretty important. It would really help when things break or updates need to be made to those processes. So finding any documentation on the processes that use your database, did anyone document the SQL jobs, the SSIS packages, any legacy DTS, being able to get that up front before the person leaves the company is very, very valuable. If you can't get it or it doesn't exist, go ahead, if the person's still there and they can do the knowledge transfer and you produce the documentation, then it's going to be good for you for at least the next 18 months, right, before you leave the company. And then it's something that you can pass down to the next DBA. I haven't had much luck in inheriting the documentation, but the teams that I work with now were really good at producing the documentation. But this is one of those things that get me quite often. Greg, any questions?
Not right now. There's things we can talk about at the end, but you can just move on to the next slide.
All right, security. Knowing who has access to the databases. So who needs access and why? Who is the database owner and why? You can't really go in and start changing people's permissions because if you don't know that that they don't need it. Now, if somebody's an SA and it's just a hard, fast rule, hey, we are removing that ability, that's great. I support a whole lot of third-party applications, and the service level account needs to be a database owner to that database. So I can't go changing that. I've even run into situations where the service account has to be a sysadmin. Bad design, but it is what it is. So we'll put that instance in containment and just document it and move on. But knowing who are the system administrators, the database owners, and having that documented, then you can at least go back if you check a month later and you see new ones that come in that you didn't add. You can determine a pattern or a potential problem. But it's also nice that down the road when something bad does happen and your boss comes up and says, hey, who could have made this change? And you produce a list of 28 people. Say, take your pick. I'm one of 28. Security admins are a little bit more tricky. So I like to tell folks, regardless if you're responsible for the database only or the entire instance, you want to know who the security admins are, because these are users that can add them to the sysadmin group, wreak whatever havoc that they want to, then remove themselves back out of the sysadmins group or unassign that role. So kind of tricky. So if you're in a very or a more secure environment where you only have SA or sysadmin to your server, and someone else has one and they won't give you SA, you can always ask for security admin. Maybe they're not intuitive enough to know what you can do with that. And once they make you security admin, you can make yourself an SA, do what you got to do, and then step back out. So these are things just to document. There's scripts available you can run. Idera has, I think it's called SQL Compliance Manager, that pulls a lot of this information for you. My auditors love that product because it thoroughly documents everything. But at least script out, document, screenshot, what the access levels are, so that you have something to go back and look, reflect on down the road. So everything I've covered up to this point, you can really address in your environment, at least document in 20 or 30 minutes. But things to start looking at further down the road are long-running queries. You want to definitely start monitoring the sysdm exec query stats to see what are those problematic queries that are running for minutes or hours at length. Are they just missing an index? Are they doing explicit conversions? What's going on? But unless you start documenting it and monitoring for it, you won't know that they exist. Start looking at the weights. SysDM OS weight stats. You can pump that out to a table. Do the deltas against it to see what are your common high weights. The biggest bottleneck I encounter with my SQL servers is disk I/O. So you want to check for the file placement of your data files to make sure that your data and your logs are separated, that TempDB is configured to best practice, that you have the right number of TempDB files, they're on high-speed disk, they're separated from your data and your log files. Are your disks configured properly? Back with SQL 2003, there was an issue with the way disks were formatted. So the partition alignment, could that be ailing you? Are you on fast disk? Monitoring and looking at the sysdm IO virtual file stats to see what are the heaviest used databases, so you can start looking at those databases to see what are your top worst offending queries, so you can start trying to tune. I did a blog post a while back that says if you're not measuring it, or if you're not monitoring it, you can't measure it. So if you don't know what is normal for your disk, how do you know when it's bad? Your compatibility levels. I'm sure many of you have databases that have been upgraded over the years from either SQL 2000 to 2005 on up to 8R2. Now we're going into 2012. 2014 is going to be out soon. When you do these upgrades and you're bringing the databases up, are you manually going in and updating the compatibility levels? I see that time and time again where we'll do upgrades, but we forget to go and check that. If we're not checking it, then we may not be able to use all the proper DMVs and tools to analyze those databases. So running sp_helpdb will show you what the compatibility level is. I really like that command. Out of the slide, to me, the most single important part of this is the recovery plan. So we've discussed backups. You've gone through. You've got the backups in place. You know that you have proper backups that you can recover. But what is your actual recovery plan? If a true disaster happened, what would you do? Is it documented? Can you pull it out and follow the plan? Do you know how to restore master? Have you ever practiced that? Do you have a place to restore it to? So you've got a database environment that's 500 gig in size, whether it be a physical server or a virtual server. The OS crashes out. It gets corrupt, blue screen. Where are you going to recover to? Do you have another server ready that's available? Do you have proper high availability and disaster recovery built out? If you're asking yourself these questions or agreeing with me saying, hey, that's a really good idea, and yeah, that's some questions we need to be asking, then it's, I don't like saying that your job's on the line, as in, hey, if you don't have this, you're fired. But your job could be on the line that, hey, your organization cannot recover from this. If you're have online transactions, you're a retail environment, and the system that holds your website and where people purchase your stuff, and you go down and it takes you 3 or 4 days to recover, did you suffer such reputational loss that your business goes bankrupt? You did your job, you've got backups, and you can recover, but you can't recover timely enough. You may still be finding another job along with everybody else in the company. So these are very critical questions to ask. Know what the plan is, so that if that time comes, and I hope none of you ever encounter it, but that now you're just executing a plan. I think I got one more slide, but Greg, did we have any questions specific to this slide?
Not for this slide. When we go to the last slide, then we can kind of circle back.
All right. So instance-related items. So I encounter people that they're only responsible for a single database in a consolidated environment. So they're really just worried about their backup and their indexes and tuning and things like that. But things that could still impact you, whether you're responsible for just a small piece of the server or you're responsible for the entire instance, is TempDB contention. So I mentioned in a previous slide about TempDB and was it configured to best practice. I've got a presentation I give on that. Idera has an incredible white paper on TempDB. But the questions I ask, is it sized right? Do you have multiple files on high-speed disk? And all that other good stuff with TempDB. Your MSDB history. I love this one. If SQL Server is wonderful with recording data and storing data, and backups are no different. If you're not executing the stored procedure to purge your backup history, you have the backup history from the time from the beginning of your instance when the first backup was made. So if you go and look at your MSDB and it's gigabytes in size, go look at the tables that hold the backup history, and you'll see that you may have years worth of data that's pretty much irrelevant to you. So it's good. Microsoft provided us the proper stored procedure, the system stored procedure to purge that data. What they didn't provide us with were the proper indexes on those tables, so that it runs efficiently. So if it's a small data set, hey, the indexes, yeah, they would help you, but it's not really crucial. But if you have a server that's been in place for, say, 3-4 years, and it's doing log shipping for 100 databases with log backups every 15 minutes, yeah, you may want to do a Bing search for MSDB indexes, apply the indexes, and then run that script to purge off all history, say over 90 days worth or 60 days, whatever is you're comfortable doing. The other is security updates. Are OS level security updates being applied to the server, and are the SQL Server hot fixes and service packs being applied? One of my pet peeves is when I run a check to look at the versioning of my environment, and I see that I have a production server running RTM. There's not many excuses of why you'd want to be running RTM in a production environment when we're now on Service Pack 3. So make sure that there's a process in place to be applying these security updates. If you want to really know the significance, just do a internet search on SQL Slammer. Also, startup parameters and various levels of triage and troubleshooting. If you get Microsoft on the phone, blog posts that reference it may tell you that you need to put in a startup parameter to start SQL Server to kind of pull the covers back on a particular issue so that you can get to some type of metadata to see what's going on. Well, say you apply the startup parameter and maybe it helped you see what you needed to do and you got your system back up, but you never went back and removed that parameter. What if one of the things that it does is run kind of a checksum or checkDB or of your environment, and it delays your SQL Server service from starting up for 30 minutes? It may not be a good thing if some event happened and you needed to restart SQL service during production hours, and now you're hosed because of the startup parameter. So just something to check and see if any are in place, and if they are, what they're for. They may be required for your product, but just know that they exist. The other thing is review any alerts configured for the server. Create any additional ones that you need. Not really having the alerts configured, there's not really valid excuses why not to have them. And then also, does your environment have any monitoring tools that are, and if so, are they set up correctly for the server? So if you're fortunate to have a network operations center that's running a big suite of apps that's monitoring the health of your environment, that the server's up, the services are running, disk space is adequate, things like that, review those alarms or those alerts for your server to make sure that they're correct, that they have the right thresholds. And if you have something like SQL Diagnostic Manager installed, that you're using it properly and the right servers are being monitored. Various helpful resources that I like to point out is, of course, MS SQL tips. Lots and lots of great articles that are produced by some of the best minds in the industry. Of course, our sponsor Idera. They have tons of tools for SQL Server. I use quite a few of them. SQL Saturdays, we have quite a few coming up. I'll be in Pittsburgh this coming weekend. Got 2 sessions there. Past Summit in October, and Charlotte this year. And then Twitter. If you're not familiar with the SQL community and our presence on Twitter, we have a lot of hashtags that we use, from SQL Help, the SQL Saturday hashtags, SQL Pass, and if you're looking for a job or you have a job that you're looking to hire someone for, there's a hashtag for SQL Jobs. But that's where a lot of our community hangs out. If you get in a jam and you need a quick question answered, hashtag SQL Help. I mean, some of the best minds in our industry are out there. I mean, the consultants that cost hundreds of dollars an hour love answering your questions, and it's free. So how to find me? I blog at timradney.com. Of course, I'm on Twitter at tradney. LinkedIn, again, tradney's my link. Facebook, I have Radney SQL is the account I use for my SQL community on there, and then my email information. So tim@timradney.com if you have any questions, or tim.radney@linchpinpeople.com. I definitely appreciate those who have participated, and I think we may have a couple of minutes that I can answer any additional questions.
Yeah, we have a little bit of time left. So one question was related to the alerting that you mentioned, and
Yes.
the person said that they see alerts within Management Studio. They're just not really understanding what that is and how to set it up, and what can you even monitor with alerts within SQL Server.
So a lot of things that happen within SQL Server generate an alert that could either write to your event log. I'll have to go back. It's been a while since I've set up. We have most of our stuff scripted out, but I believe it's alert 25 and over are like the critical events that happen. So enabling those alerts is really straightforward. You just enable it and you set what the action is. To email. If you just do a quick search online on SQL Server alerts, Brent Ozar has quite a few blogs that he's put together, and I believe he even has a webcast. I'd probably also search the Secrets of SQL Server monthly webcast series to see if someone's done a presentation just on setting that up and configuring it. It's not overly complicated, but it's not as I joke and say it's as simple as just clicking through it, but it kind of is. But this gentleman or individual sounds like they want to know more about the custom alerts and which ones are more critical. But all that's documented free online.
All right, thanks, Tim. Well, we're actually out of time, so I want to thank Tim for all that great material and taking the time to present today. I also want to thank Idera for sponsoring today's webcast. Once again, if you can visit their website, www.idera.com, there's a lot of tools that Tim had mentioned. They also have a bunch of free tools that you can download, you can start using immediately for checking for corruption, for doing performance checking, and so forth. So again, take a look at all those tools, the free tools as well as their flagship tools. Also want to thank everybody for taking the time today to attend. Totally appreciate you coming out today. And just ask, as when you exit the webcast, you just take a couple minutes to fill out the survey that helps with today's webcast as well as future webcasts. This webcast was recorded, and you'll receive a follow-up email with links to both the slides and the archive recording, and that should probably go out within the next few days. Once again, thanks for attending, and hope you all have a great day.